The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Doctor, London is literally new to me, new in its streets, houses, and even in its situation. As the Irishman said, London is now gone out of town. What I left open fields, producing hay and corn, I now find covered with streets and squares, and palaces, and churches. I am credibly informed that in the space of 7 years, 11,000 new houses have been built in 1/4 of Westminster, exclusive of what is daily added to other parts of this unwieldy metropolis. Pimlico and Knightsbridge are now almost joined to Chelsea and Kensington, and if this infatuation continues for half a century, I suppose the whole county of Middlesex will be covered with brick. It must be allowed, indeed, for the credit of the present age, that London and Westminster are much better paved and lighted than they were formerly. The new streets are spacious, regular, and airy, and the houses generally convenient. The bridge at Blackfriars is a noble monument of taste and public spirit. I wonder how they stumbled upon a work of such magnificence and utility. But, notwithstanding these improvements, the capital is become an overgrown monster, which, like a dropsical head, will in time leave the body and extremities without nourishment and support. The absurdity will appear in its full force, when we consider that 1/6 part of the natives of this whole extensive kingdom is crowded within the bills of mortality. What wonder that our villages are depopulated, and our farms in want of day laborers? The abolition of small farms is but one cause of the decrease of population. Indeed, the incredible increase of horses and black cattle, to answer the purposes of luxury, requires a prodigious quantity of hay and grass, which are raised and managed without much labor, but a number of hands will always be wanted for the different branches of agriculture, whether the farms be large or small. The tide of luxury has swept all the inhabitants from the open country. The poorest squire, as well as the richest peer, must have his house in town, and make a figure with an extraordinary number of domestics. The ploughboys, cowherds, and lower hinds are debauched and seduced by the appearance and discourse of those coxcombs in livery, when they make their summer excursions. They desert their dirt and drudgery, and swarm up to London, in hopes of getting into service, where they can live luxuriously and wear fine clothes, without being obliged to work, for idleness is natural to man. Great numbers of these, being disappointed in their expectation, become thieves and sharpers, and London being an immense wilderness, in which there is neither watch nor ward of any signification, nor any order or police, affords them lurking places as well as prey. There are many causes that contribute to the daily increase of this enormous mass, but they may be all resolved into the grand source of luxury and corruption. About 25 years ago, very few, even of the most opulent citizens of London, kept any equipage, or even any servants in livery. Their tables produced nothing but plain boiled and roasted, with a bottle of port and a tankard of beer. At present, every trader in any degree of credit, every broker and attorney, maintains a couple of footmen, a coachman, and postilion. He has his town house, and his country house, his coach, and his post-chaise. His wife and daughters appear in the richest stuffs, bespangled with diamonds. They frequent the court, the opera, the theatre, and the masquerade. They hold assemblies at their own houses, they make sumptuous entertainments, and treat with the richest wines of Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne. The substantial tradesman, who wont to pass his evenings at the alehouse for 4 halfpenny, now spends 3 shillings at the tavern. While his wife keeps card tables at home, she must likewise have fine clothes, her chaise, or pad, with country lodgings, and go 3 times a week to public diversions. Every clerk, apprentice, and even waiter of tavern or coffee house, maintains a gelding by himself, or in partnership, and assumes the air and apparel of a petit maître. The gayest places of public entertainment are filled with fashionable figures, which, upon inquiry, will be found to be journeymen tailors, serving men, and abigails, disguised like their betters. In Short, there is no distinction or subordination left, the different departments of life are jumbled together, the hod carrier, the low mechanic, the tapster, the publican, the shopkeeper, the pettifogger, the citizen, and courtier, all tread upon the kibes of one another, actuated by the demons of profligacy and licentiousness. They are seen everywhere rambling, riding, rolling, rushing, justling, mixing, bouncing, cracking, and crashing in one vile ferment of stupidity and corruption. All is tumult and hurry. One would imagine they were impelled by some disorder of the brain, that will not suffer them to be at rest. The foot passengers run along as if they were pursued by bailiffs. The porters and chairmen trot with their burthens. People, who keep their own equipages, drive through the streets at full speed. Even citizens, physicians, and apothecaries, glide in their chariots like lightning. The hackney coachmen make their horses smoke, and the pavement shakes under them, and I have actually seen a wagon pass through Piccadilly at the hand gallop. In a word, the whole nation seems to be running out of their wits. The diversions of the times are not ill-suited to the genius of this incongruous monster, called the public. Give it noise, confusion, glare, and glitter, it has no idea of elegance and propriety. What are the amusements of Ranelagh? One half of the company are following at the other's tails, in an eternal circle, like so many blind asses in an olive mill, where they can neither discourse, distinguish, nor be distinguished, while the other half are drinking hot water, under the denomination of tea, till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, to keep them awake for the rest of the evening. As for the orchestra, the vocal music especially, it is well for the performers that they cannot be heard distinctly. Vauxhall is a composition of baubles, overcharged with paltry ornaments, ill-conceived, and poorly executed, without any unity of design, or propriety of disposition. It is an unnatural assembly of objects, fantastically illuminated in broken masses, seemingly contrived to dazzle the eyes and divert the imagination of the vulgar. Here a wooden lion, there a stone statue, in one place, a range of things like coffee-house boxes, covered atop, in another, a parcel of alehouse benches, in a third, a puppet show representation of a tent cascade, in a fourth, a gloomy cave of a circular form, like a sepulchral vault half-lighted, in a fifth, a scanty flip of grass plat, that would not afford pasture sufficient for an ass's colt. The walks, which nature seems to have intended for solitude, shade, and silence, are filled with crowds of noisy people, sucking up the nocturnal rooms of an aguish climate, and through these gay scenes, a few lamps glimmer like so many farthing candles. When I see a number of well-dressed people, of both sexes, sitting on the covered benches, exposed to the eyes of the mob, and, which is worse, to the cold, raw, night air, devouring sliced beef, and swilling port, and punch, and cider, I can't help compassionating their temerity. White I despise their want of taste and decorum, but, when they course along those damp and gloomy walks, or crowd together upon the wet gravel, without any other cover than the cope of heaven, listening to a song, which one half of them cannot possibly hear, how can I help supposing they are actually possessed by a spirit, more absurd and pernicious than anything we meet with in the precincts of Bedlam? In all probability, the proprietors of this, and other public gardens of inferior note, in the skirts of the metropolis, are, in some shape, connected with the faculty of physic, and the company of undertakers, for, considering that eagerness in the pursuit of what is called pleasure, which now predominates through every rank and denomination of life, I am persuaded that more gouts, rheumatisms, catarrhs, and consumptions are caught in these nocturnal pastimes, sub dio, than from all the risks and accidents to which a life of toil and danger is exposed. All these, and other observations, which I have made in this excursion, will shorten my stay at London, and send me back with a double relish to my solitude and mountains, but I shall return by a different route from that which brought me to town. I have seen some old friends, who constantly resided in this virtuous metropolis, but they are so changed in manners and disposition, that we hardly know or care for one another. In our journey from Bath, my sister Tabby provoked me into a transport of passion, during which, like a man who has drank himself pot valiant, I talked to her in such a style of authority and resolution, as produced a most blessed effect. She and her dog have been remarkably quiet and orderly ever since this expostulation. How long this agreeable calm will last, heaven above knows. I flatter myself, the exercise of traveling has been of service to my health, a circumstance which encourages me to proceed in my projected expedition to the north. But I must, in the meantime, for the benefit and amusement of my pupils, explore the depths of this chaos, this misshapen and monstrous capital, without head or tail, members or proportion. Thomas was so insolent to my sister on the road, that I was obliged to turn him off abruptly. Betwixt Chippenham and Marlborough, where our coach was overturned, the fellow was always sullen and selfish, but, if he should return to the country, you may give him a character for honesty and sobriety, and, provided he behaves with proper respect to the family, let him have a couple of guineas in the name of yours always, Matt. Bramble, London. To Miss Letitia Willis, at Gloucester. My dear Letty, inexpressible was the pleasure I received from yours of the 25th, which was last night put into my hands by Mrs. Brentford, the milliner, from Gloucester. I rejoice to hear that my worthy governess is in good health, and, still more, that she no longer retains any displeasure towards her poor Liddy. I am sorry you have lost the society of the agreeable Miss Vaughan, but I hope you won't have cause much longer to regret the departure of your school companions, as I make no doubt but your parents will, in a little time, bring you into the world, where you are so well qualified to make a distinguished figure. When that is the case, I flatter myself you and I shall meet again, and be happy together, and even improve the friendship which we contracted in our tender years. This at least I can promise. It shall not be for the want of my utmost endeavors, if our intimacy does not continue for life. About 5 days ago we arrived in London, after an easy journey from Bath, during which, however, we were overturned, and met with some other little incidents, which had like to have occasioned a misunderstanding betwixt my uncle and aunt. But now, thank God, they are happily reconciled, we live in harmony together, and every day make parties to see the wonders of this vast metropolis, which, however, I cannot pretend to describe, for I have not as yet seen 1/100th part of its curiosities, and I am quite in a maze of admiration. The cities of London and Westminster are spread out into an incredible extent. The streets, squares, rows, lanes, and alleys, are innumerable. Palaces, public buildings, and churches rise in every quarter, and, among these last, St. Paul's appears with the most astonishing preeminence. They say it is not so large as St. Peter's at Rome, but, for my own part, I can have no idea of any earthly temple more grand and magnificent. But even these superb objects are not so striking as the crowds of people that swarm in the streets. I at first imagined that some great assembly was just dismissed, and wanted to stand aside till the multitude should pass, but this human tide continues to flow, without interruption or abatement, from morn till night. Then there is such an infinity of gay equipages, coaches, chariots, chaises, and other carriages, continually rolling and shifting before your eyes, that one's head grows giddy looking at them, and the imagination is quite confounded with splendor and variety. Nor is the prospect by water less grand and astonishing than that by land. You see 3 stupendous bridges, joining the opposite banks of a broad, deep, and rapid river, so vast, so stately, so elegant, that they seem to be the work of the giants. Betwixt them, the whole surface of the Thames is covered with small vessels, barges, boats, and wherries, passing to and fro, and below the 3 bridges, such a prodigious forest of masts, for miles together, that you would think all the ships in the universe were here assembled. All that you read of wealth and grandeur in the Arabian Nights' Entertainment, and the Persian tales, concerning Baghdad, Diyarbakir, Damascus, Ispahan, and Samarkand, is here realized. Ranelagh looks like the enchanted palace of a genie, adorned with the most exquisite performances of painting, carving, and gilding, enlightened with 1,000 golden lamps, that emulate the noonday sun, crowded with the great, the rich, the gay, the happy, and the fair, glittering with cloth of gold and silver, lace, embroidery, and precious stones, while these exulting sons and daughters of felicity tread this round of pleasure, or regale in different parties, and separate lodges, with fine imperial tea and other delicious refreshments. Their ears are entertained with the most ravishing delights of music, both instrumental and vocal. There I heard the famous tentussi, a thing from Italy. It looks for all the world like a man, though they say it is not. The voice, to be sure, is neither man's nor woman's, but it is more melodious than either, and it warbled so divinely, that, while I listened, I really thought myself in paradise. At 9 o'clock, in a charming moonlight evening, we embarked at Ranelagh for Vauxhall, in a wherry so light and slender that we looked like so many fairies sailing in a nutshell. My uncle, being apprehensive of catching cold upon the water, went round in the coach, and my aunt would have accompanied him, but he would not suffer me to go by water if she went by land, and therefore she favoured us with her company, as she perceived I had a curiosity to make this agreeable voyage. After all, the vessel was sufficiently loaded, for, besides the waterman, there was my brother Jery, and a friend of his, one, Mr. Barton, a country gentleman, of a good fortune, who had dined at our house. The pleasure of this little excursion was, however, damped by my being sadly frighted at our landing, where there was a terrible confusion of wherries and a crowd of people bawling, and swearing, and quarrelling. Nay, a parcel of ugly-looking fellows came running into the water, and laid hold of our boat with great violence, to pull it ashore, nor would they quit their hold till my brother struck one of them over the head with his cane. But this flutter was fully recompensed by the pleasures of Vauxhall, which I no sooner entered, than I was dazzled and confounded with the variety of beauties that rushed all at once upon my eye. Image to yourself, my dear Letty, a spacious garden, part laid out in delightful walks, bounded with high hedges and trees, and paved with gravel, part exhibiting a wonderful assemblage of the most picturesque and striking objects: pavilions, lodges, groves, grottos, lawns, temples and cascades, porticos, colonnades, and rotundos, adorned with pillars, statues, and painting, the whole illuminated with an infinite number of lamps, disposed in different figures of suns, stars, and constellations, the place crowded with the gayest company, ranging through those blissful shades, or supping in different lodges on cold collations, enlivened with mirth, freedom, and good humor, and animated by an excellent band of music. Among the vocal performers I had the happiness to hear the celebrated Mrs., whose voice was loud and shrill, that it made my head ache through excess of pleasure. In about half an hour after we arrived we were joined by my uncle, who did not seem to relish the place. People of experience and infirmity, my dear Letty, see with very different eyes from those that such as you and I make use of. Our evening's entertainment was interrupted by an unlucky accident. In one of the remotest walks we were surprised with a sudden shower, that set the whole company a-running, and drove us in heaps, one upon another, into the rotunda, where my uncle, finding himself wet, began to be very peevish and urgent to be gone. My brother went to look for the coach, and found it with much difficulty, but as it could not hold us all, Mr. Barton stayed behind. It was some time before the carriage could be brought up to the gate. In the confusion, notwithstanding the utmost endeavours of our new footman, Humphry Clinker, who lost his scratch periwig, and got a broken head in the scuffle. The moment we were seated, my aunt pulled off my uncle's shoes, and carefully wrapped his poor feet in her capuchin. Then she gave him a mouthful of cordial, which she always keeps in her pocket, and his clothes were shifted as soon as we arrived at lodgings, so that, blessed be God, he escaped a severe cold, of which he was in great terror. As for Mr. Barton, I must tell you in confidence, he was a little particular, but, Perhaps I mistake his complaisance, and I wish I may, for his sake. You know the condition of my poor heart, which, in spite of hard usage, and yet I ought not to complain, nor will I, till further information. Besides, Raineland Vauxhall, I have been at Mrs. Cornely's assembly, which, for the rooms, the company, the dresses, and decorations, surpasses all description, but as I have no great turn for card playing, I have not yet entered thoroughly into the spirit of the place. Indeed, I am still such a country hoyden, that I could hardly find patience to be put in a condition to appear, yet, as I was not above 6 hours under the hands of the hairdresser, who stuffed my head with as much black wool as would have made a quilted petticoat, and, after all, it was the smallest head in the assembly, except my aunt's, she, to be sure, was so particular with her rumped gown and petticoat, her scanty curls, her lappeth head, deep triple ruffles, and high stays, that everybody looked at her with surprise, some whispered, and some tittered, and Lady Griskin, by whom we were introduced, flatly told her, she was 20 good years behind the fashion. Lady Griskin is a person of fashion, to whom we have the honor to be related. She keeps a small rout at her own house, never exceeding 10 or a dozen card tables, but these are frequented by the best company in town. She has been so obliging as to introduce my aunt and me to some of her particular friends of quality, who treat us with the most familiar good humor. We have once dined with her, and she takes the trouble to direct us in all our motions. I am so happy as to have gained her goodwill to such a degree, that she sometimes adjusts my cap with her own hands, and she has given me a kind invitation to stay with her all the winter. This, however, has been cruelly declined by my uncle, who seems to be, I know not how, prejudiced against the good lady, for, whenever my aunt happens to speak in her commendation, I observe that he makes wry faces, though he says nothing. Perhaps, indeed, these grimaces may be the effect of pain arising from the gout and rheumatism, with which he is sadly distressed. To me, however, he is always good-natured and generous, even beyond my wish. Since we came hither, he has made me a present of a suit of clothes, with trimmings and laces, which cost more money than I shall mention, and Jery, at his desire, has given me my mother's diamond crops, which are ordered to be set anew, so that it won't be his fault if I do not glitter among the stars of the 4th or 5th magnitude. I wish my weak head may not grow giddy in the midst of all this gallantry and dissipation, though, as yet, I can safely declare, I could gladly give up all these tumultuous pleasures, for country solitude, and a happy retreat with those we love, among whom, my dear Willis will always possess the first place in the breast of her ever affectionate, Lydia Melford. London. To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Oxon. Dear Phillips, I send you this letter, franked by our old friend Barton, who is as much altered as it was possible for a man of his kidney to be. Instead of the careless, indolent sloven we knew at Oxford, I found him a busy talkative politician, a petit maître in his dress, and a ceremonious courtier in his manners. He has not gall enough in his constitution to be inflamed with the rancor of party, so as to deal in scurrilous invectives, but, since he obtained a place, he has become a warm partisan of the ministry, and sees everything through such an exaggerating medium, as to me, who am happily of no party, is altogether incomprehensible. Without all doubt, the fumes of faction not only disturb the faculty of reason, but also pervert the organs of sense, and I would lay 100 guineas to 10, that if Barton on one side, and the most conscientious patriot in the opposition on the other, were to draw, upon honor, the picture of the king, or ministers, you and I, who are still uninfected, and unbiased, would find both painters equally distant from the truth. One thing, however, must be allowed for the honor of Barton, he never breaks out into illiberal abuse, far less endeavors, by infamous calumnies, to blast the moral character of any individual on the other side. Ever since we came hither, he has been remarkably assiduous in his attention to our family, an attention, which, In a man of his indolence and avocations, I should have thought altogether odd, and even unnatural, had not I perceived that my sister, Lydia, had made some impression upon his heart. I cannot say that I have any objection to his trying his fortune in this pursuit, if an opulent estate and a great flock of good nature are sufficient qualifications in a husband, to render the marriage state happy for life. She may be happy with Barton, but, I imagine, there is something else required to engage and secure the affection of a woman of sense and delicacy, something which nature has denied our friend. Lydia seems to be of the same opinion. When he addresses himself to her in discourse, she seems to listen with reluctance, and industriously avoids all particular communication, but in proportion to her coyness, our aunt is coming. Mrs. Tabitha goes more than halfway to meet his advances. She mistakes, or affects to mistake, the meaning of his courtesy, which is rather formal and fulsome. She returns his compliments with hyperbolical interest, she persecutes him with her civilities at table, she appeals to him forever in conversation, she sighs, and flirts, and ogles, and by her hideous affectation and impertinence, drives the poor courtier to the very extremity of his complaisance. In short, she seems to have undertaken the siege of Barton's heart, and carries on her approaches in such a desperate manner, that I don't know whether he will not be obliged to capitulate. In the meantime, his aversion to this inamorata struggling with his acquired affability, and his natural fear of giving offense, throws him into a kind of distress which is extremely ridiculous. 2 days ago, he persuaded my uncle and me to accompany him to St. James's, where he undertook to make us acquainted with the persons of all the great men in the kingdom, and, indeed, there was a great assemblage of distinguished characters, for it was a high festival at court. Our conductor performed his promise with great punctuality. He pointed out almost every individual of both sexes, and generally introduced them to our notice, with a flourish of panegyric. Seeing the king approach, "There comes," said he, "the most amiable sovereign that ever swayed the sceptre of England, the Delicia Humani Generis, Augustus, in patronizing merit, Titus Vespasian in generosity, Trajan in beneficence, and Marcus Aurelius in philosophy. A very honest kind-hearted gentleman," added my uncle, "he's too good for the times. A king of England should have a spice of the devil in his composition." Barton, then turning to the Duke of Cumberland, proceeded, "You know the Duke, that illustrious hero, who trod rebellion under his feet, and secured us in possession of everything we ought to hold dear, as Englishmen and Christians. Mark what an eye, how penetrating, yet pacific. What dignity in his mien. What humanity in his aspect, even malice, must own, that he is one of the greatest officers in Christendom." "I think he is," said Mr. Bramble, "but who are these young gentlemen that stand beside him?" "Those," cried our friend, "those are his royal nephews, the princes of the blood. Sweet young princes. The sacred pledges of the Protestant line, so spirited, so sensible, so princely, yes, very sensible. Very spirited," said my uncle, interrupting him, "but see the Queen. Ha! There's the Queen! There's the Queen. Let me see, where are my glasses? Ha! There's meaning in that eye, there's sentiment, there's expression. Well, Mr. Barton, what figure do you call next?" The next person he pointed out, was the favourite Earl, who stood solitary by one of the windows. "Behold yon northern star," said he, shorn of his beams. "What, the Caledonian luminary, that lately blazed so bright in our hemisphere? Methinks, at present, it glimmers through a fog, like Saturn without his ring, bleak, and dim, and distant. Ha, there's the other great phenomenon, the grand pensionary, that weathercock of patriotism that veers about in every point of the political compass, and still feels the wind of popularity in his tail. He too, like a portentous comet, has risen again above the court horizon, but how long he will continue to ascend, it is not easy to foretell, considering his great eccentricity. Who are those 2 satellites that attend his motions?" When Barton told him their names, to their characters, said Mr. Bramble, I am no stranger. One of them, without a drop of red blood in his veins, has a cold intoxicating vapor in his head, and rancor enough in his heart to inoculate and affect a whole nation. The other is, I hear, intended for a share in the administration, and the pensionary vouches for his being duly qualified. The only instance I ever heard of his sagacity, was his deserting his former patron, when he found him declining in power, and in disgrace with the people. Without principle, talent, or intelligence, he is ungracious as a hog, greedy as a vulture, and thievish as a jackdaw, but, it must be owned, he is no hypocrite. He pretends to no virtue, and takes no pains to disguise his character. His ministry will be attended with one advantage: no man will be disappointed by his breach of promise, as no mortal ever trusted to his word. I wonder how Lord first discovered this happy genius, and for what purpose Lord has now adopted him, but one would think, that as amber has a power to attract dirt, and straws, and chaff, a minister is endued with the same kind of faculty, to lick up every knave and blockhead in his way. His eulogium was interrupted by the arrival of the old Duke of Ondash, who, squeezing into the circle with a busy face of importance, thrust his head into every countenance, as if he had been in search of somebody, to whom he wanted to impart something of great consequence. My uncle, who had been formerly known to him, bowed as he passed, and the Duke, seeing himself saluted so respectfully by a well-dressed person, was not slow in returning the courtesy. He even came up, and, taking him cordially by the hand, "My dear friend, Mr. A," said he, "I am rejoiced to see you. How long have you been come from abroad? How did you leave our good friends the Dutch? The King of Prussia don't think of another war. He's a great king. A great conqueror. A very great conqueror. Your Alexanders and Hannibals were nothing at all to him, sir. Corporals. Drummers. Dross. Mere trash, damn trash, hey? His Grace being by this time out of breath, my uncle took the opportunity to tell him he had not been out of England, that his name was Bramble, and that he had the honour to sit in the last Parliament but one of the late King, as representative for the borough of Dimkey-Mrigg. "What so?" cried the Duke. "I remember you perfectly well, my dear Mr. Bramble. You was always a good and loyal subject, a staunch friend to administration. I made your brother an Irish bishop." "Pardon me, my lord," said the squire, "I once had a brother, but he was a captain in the army." "Ha!" said his Grace, "he was so, he was, indeed. But who was the bishop then?" "Bishop Blackberry, sure it was Bishop Blackberry." "Perhaps some relation of yours." "Very likely, my lord," replied my uncle. "The blackberry is the fruit of the bramble, but, I believe, the bishop is not a berry of our bush." "No more he is, no more he is." "Ha, ha, ha!" exclaimed the Duke, "there you gave me a scratch, good Mr. Bramble. Ha, ha, ha!" Well, I shall be glad to see you at Lincoln's Inn Fields. You know the way. Times are altered. Though I have lost the power, I retain the inclination. Your very humble servant, good Mr. Blackberry." So saying, he shoved to another corner of the room. "What a fine old gentleman!" cried Mr. Barton. "What spirits! What a memory! He never forgets an old friend." "He does me too much honour," observed our squire, "to rank me among the number whilst I sat in Parliament. I never voted with the ministry but 3 times, when my conscience told me they were in the right. However, if he still keeps levy, I will carry my nephew thither, that he may see, and learn to avoid the scene. For, I think, an English gentleman never appears to such disadvantage, as at the levee of a minister. Of his Grace I shall say nothing at present, but that for 30 years he was the constant and common butt of ridicule and execration. He was generally laughed at as an ape in politics, whose office and influence served only to render his folly the more notorious, and the opposition cursed him, as the indefatigable drudge of a first mover, who was justly styled and stigmatized as the father of corruption. But this ridiculous ape, this venal drudge, no sooner lost the places he was so ill qualified to fill, and unfurled the banners of faction, than he was metamorphosed into a pattern of public virtue. The very people who reviled him before, now extolled him to the skies, as a wise, experienced statesman, chief pillar of the Protestant succession, and cornerstone of English liberty. I should be glad to know how Mr. Barton reconciles these contradictions, without obliging us to resign all title to the privilege of common sense. My dear sir, answered Barton, I don't pretend to justify the extravagations of the multitude, who, I suppose, were as wild in their former censure, as in the present praise, but I shall be very glad to attend you on Thursday next to his Grace's levee, where, I'm afraid, we shall not be crowded with company, for, you know, there's a wide difference between his present office of President of the Council, and his former post of First Lord Commissioner of the Treasury. This communicative friend having announced all the remarkable characters of both sexes that appeared at court, we resolved to adjourn, and retired. At the foot of the staircase, there was a crowd of lacqueys and chairmen, and in the midst of them stood Humphry Clinker, exalted upon a stool, with his hat in one hand, and a paper in the other, in the act of holding forth to the people. Before we could inquire into the meaning of this exhibition, he perceived his master, thrust the paper into his pocket, descended from his elevation, bolted through the crowd, and brought up the carriage to the gate. My uncle said nothing till we were seated, when, after having looked at me earnestly for some time, he burst out laughing, and asked if I knew upon what subject Clinker was holding forth to the mob. If, said he, the fellow is turned mountebank, I must turn him out of my service, otherwise he'll make Merry Andrews of us all. I observed, that, in all probability, he had studied medicine under his master, who was a farrier. At dinner, the squire asked him, if he had ever practised physic? Yes, and, please your honour, said he, among brute beasts, but I never meddle with rational creatures. I know not whether you rank in that class the audience you was haranguing in the court at St. James's, but I should be glad to know what kind of powders you was distributing, and whether you had a good sale, sir. Cried Clinker, I hope I shall never be base enough to sell for gold and silver, what freely comes of God's grace. I distributed nothing, unlike your honour, but a word of advice to my fellows in servitude and sin. Advice? Concerning what? Concerning profane swearing, and please your honour, so horrid and shocking, that it made my hair stand on end. Nay, if thou canst cure them of that disease, I shall think thee a wonderful doctor indeed. Why not cure them, my good master? The hearts of those poor people are not so stubborn as your honour seems to think. Make them first sensible that you have nothing in view but their good, then they will listen with patience, and easily be convinced of the sin and folly of a practice that affords neither profit nor pleasure. At this remark, our uncle changed colour, and looked round the company, conscious that his own withers were not altogether unwrung. But, Clinker, said he, if you should have eloquence enough to persuade the vulgar to resign those tropes and figures of rhetoric, there will be little or nothing left to distinguish their conversation from that of their betters. But then your honour knows, their conversation will be void of offence, and, at the day of judgment, there will be no distinction of persons. Humphry going downstairs to fetch up a bottle of wine, my uncle congratulated his sister upon having such a reformer in the family, when Mrs. Tabitha declared, he was a sober civilized fellow, very respectful, and very industrious, and, she believed, a good Christian into the bargain. One would think, Clinker must really have some very extraordinary talent, to ingratiate himself in this manner, with a virago of her character, so fortified against him with prejudice and resentment, but the truth is, since the adventure of Salt Hill, Mrs. Tabby seems to be entirely changed. She has left off scolding the servants, an exercise which was grown habitual, and even seemed necessary to her constitution, and is become so indifferent to Chowder, as to part with him in a present to Lady Griskin, who proposes to bring the breed of him into fashion. Her ladyship is the widow of Sir Timothy Griskin, a distant relation of our family. She enjoys a jointure of £500 a year, and makes shift to spend 3 times that sum. Her character before marriage was a little equivocal, but at present she lives in the Bon Ton, keeps card tables, gives private suppers to select friends, and is visited by persons of the first fashion. She has been remarkably civil to us all, and cultivates my uncle with the most particular regard, but the more she strokes him, the more his bristles seem to rise to her compliments. He makes very laconic and dry returns. T'other day she sent us a pottle of fine strawberries, which he did not receive without signs of disgust, muttering from the Aeneid, Timeo, Danaos et Donaference. She has twice called for Liddy, of a forenoon, to take an airing in the coach, but Mrs. Tabby was always so alert, I suppose by his direction, that she never could have the niece without her aunt's company. I have endeavored to sound square toes on this subject, but he carefully avoids all explanation. I have now, dear Phillips, filled a whole sheet, and if you have read it to an end, I dare say, you are as tired as your humble servant, J. To Dr. Lewis. Yes, Doctor, I have seen the British Museum, which is a noble collection, and even stupendous, if we consider it was made by a private man, a physician, who was obliged to make his own fortune at the same time, but great as the collection is, it would appear more striking if it was arranged in one spacious saloon, instead of being divided into different apartments, which it does not entirely fill. I could wish the series of medals was connected, and the whole of the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms completed, by adding to each, at the public expense, those articles that are wanting. It would likewise be a great improvement, with respect to the library, if the deficiencies were made up, by purchasing all the books of character that are not to be found already in the collection. They might be classed in centuries, according to the dates of their publication, and catalogues printed of them and the manuscripts, for the information of those that want to consult, or compile from such authorities. I could also wish, for the honor of the nation, that there was a complete apparatus for a course of mathematics, mechanics, and experimental philosophy, and a good salary, settled upon an able professor, who should give regular lectures on these subjects. But this is all idle speculation, which will never be reduced to practice. Considering the temper of the times, it is a wonder to see any institution whatsoever established for the benefit of the public. The spirit of party is risen to a kind of frenzy, unknown to former ages, or rather degenerated to a total extinction of honesty and candor. You know, I have observed, for some time, that the public papers are become the infamous vehicles of the most cruel and perfidious defamation. Every rancorous knave, every desperate incendiary, that can afford to spend half a crown or 3 shillings, may skulk behind the press of a newsmonger, and have a stab at the first character in the kingdom, without running the least hazard of detection or punishment. I have made acquaintance with a Mr. Barton, whom Jery knew at Oxford, a good sort of a man, though most ridiculously warped in his political principles, but his partiality is the less offensive, as it never appears in the style of scurrility and abuse. He is a member of Parliament, and a retainer to the court, and his whole conversation turns upon the virtues and perfections of the ministers, who are his patrons. T'other day, when he was bedaubing one of those worthies, with the most fulsome praise, I told him I had seen the same nobleman characterized very differently, in one of the daily papers, indeed, so stigmatized, that if one half of what was said of him was true, he must be not only unfit to rule, but even unfit to live, that those impeachments had been repeated again and again, with the addition of fresh matter, and that as he had taken no steps towards his own vindication, I began to think there was some foundation for the charge. And pray, sir, said Mr. Barton, what steps would you have him take? Suppose he should prosecute the publisher, who screens the anonymous accuser, and bring him to the pillory for a libel. This is so far from being counted a punishment, in terram, that it will probably make his fortune. The multitude immediately take him into their protection, as a martyr to the cause of defamation, which they have always espoused. They pay his fine, they contribute to the increase of his stock, his shop is crowded with customers, and the sale of his paper rises in proportion to the scandal it contains. All this time the prosecutor is inveighed against as a tyrant and oppressor, for having chosen to proceed by the way of information, which is deemed a grievance, but if he lays an action for damages, he must prove the damage, and I leave you to judge, whether a gentleman's character may not be brought into contempt, and all his views in life blasted by calumny, without his being able to specify the particulars of the damage he has sustained. This spirit of defamation is a kind of heresy, that thrives under persecution. The liberty of the press is a term of great efficacy, and like that of the Protestant religion, has often served the purposes of sedition. A minister, therefore, must arm himself with patience, and bear those attacks without repining, whatever mischief they may do. In other respects, they certainly contribute, in one particular, to the advantages of government, for those defamatory articles have multiplied papers in such a manner, and augmented their sale to such a degree, that the duty upon stamps and advertisements has made a very considerable addition to the revenue. Certain it is, a gentleman's honor is a very delicate subject to be handled by a jury, composed of men, who cannot be supposed remarkable either for sentiment or impartiality. In such a case, indeed, the defendant is tried, not only by his peers, but also by his party, and I really think, that of all patriots, he is the most resolute who exposes himself to such detraction, for the sake of his country. If, from the ignorance or partiality of juries, a gentleman can have no redress from law, for being defamed in a pamphlet or newspaper, I know but one other method of proceeding against the publisher, which is attended with some risque, but has been practiced successfully, more than once. In my remembrance, a regiment of horse was represented, in one of the newspapers, as having misbehaved at Dettingen. A captain of that regiment broke the publisher's bones, telling him, at the same time, if he went to law, he should certainly have the like salutation from every officer of the corps. Governor took the same satisfaction on the ribs of an author, who traduced him by name in a periodical paper. I know a low fellow of the same class, who, being turned out of Venice for his impudence and scurrility, retired to Lugano, a town of the Grisons, a free people, God wot, where he found a printing press, from whence he squirted his filth at some respectable characters in the Republic, which he had been obliged to abandon. Some of these, finding him out of the reach of legal chastisement, employed certain useful instruments, such as may be found in all countries, to give him the bastinado, which, being repeated more than once, effectually stopped the current of his abuse. As for the liberty of the press, like every other privilege, it must be restrained within certain bounds, for if it is carried to a branch of law, religion, and charity, it becomes one of the greatest evils that ever annoyed the community. If the lowest ruffian may stab your good name with impunity in England, will you be so uncandid as to exclaim against Italy for the practice of common assassination? To what purpose is our property secured, if our moral character is left defenseless? People thus baited, grow desperate, and the despair of being able to preserve one's character, untainted by such vermin, produces a total neglect of fame, so that one of the chief incitements to the practice of virtue is effectually destroyed. Mr. Barton's last consideration, respecting the stamp duty, is equally wise and laudable with another maxim which has been long adopted by our financiers, namely, to connive at drunkenness, riot, and dissipation, because they enhance the receipt of the excise, not reflecting, that in providing this temporary convenience, they are destroying the morals, health, and industry of the people. Notwithstanding my contempt for those who flatter a minister, I think there is something still more despicable in flattering a mob. When I see a man of birth, education, and fortune, put himself on a level with the dregs of the people, mingle with low mechanics, feed with them at the same board, and drink with them in the same cup, flatter their prejudices, harangue in praise of their virtues, expose themselves to the belchings of their beer, the fumes of their tobacco, the grossness of their familiarity, and the impertinence of their conversation, I cannot help despising him, as a man guilty of the vilest prostitution, in order to effect a purpose equally selfish and illiberal. I should renounce politics the more willingly, if I could find other topics of conversation discussed with more modesty and candor, but the demon of party seems to have usurped every department of life. Even the world of literature and taste is divided into the most virulent factions, which revile, decry, and traduce the works of one another. Yesterday, I went to return an afternoon's visit to a gentleman of my acquaintance, at whose house I found one of the authors of the present age, who has written with some success, as I had read one or two of his performances, which gave me pleasure. I was glad of this opportunity to know his person, but his discourse and deportment destroyed all the impressions which his writings had made in his favor. He took upon him to decide dogmatically upon every subject, without deigning to show the least cause for his differing from the general opinions of mankind, as if it had been our duty to acquiesce in the Stixit of this new Pythagoras. He rejudged the characters of all the principal authors, who had died within a century of the present time, and, in this revision, paid no sort of regard to the reputation they had acquired. Milton was harsh and prosaic, Dryden, languid and verbose, Butler and Swift without humor, Congreve, without wit, and Pope destitute of any sort of poetical merit. As for his contemporaries, he could not bear to hear one of them mentioned with any degree of applause. They were all dunces, pedants, plagiaries, quacks, and impostors, and you could not name a single performance, but what was tame, stupid, and insipid. It must be owned that this writer had nothing to charge his conscience with, on the side of flattery, for I understand, he was never known to praise one line that was written, even by those with whom he lived on terms of good fellowship. This arrogance and presumption, in depreciating authors, for whose reputation the company may be interested, is such an insult upon the understanding, as I could not bear without wincing. I desired to know his reasons for decrying some works, which had afforded me uncommon pleasure, and, as demonstration did not seem to be his talent, I dissented from his opinion with great freedom. Having been spoiled by the deference and humility of his hearers, he did not bear contradiction with much temper, and the dispute might have grown warm, had it not been interrupted by the entrance of a rival bard, at whose appearance he always quits the place. They are of different cabals, and have been at open war these 20 years. If the other was dogmatical, this genius was declamatory. He did not discourse, but harangue, and his orations were equally tedious and turgid. He too pronounces ex cathedra upon the characters of his contemporaries, and though he scruples not to deal out praise, even lavishly, to the lowest reptile in Grub Street who will either flatter him in private, or mount the public rostrum as his panegyrist, he damns all the other writers of the age, with the utmost insolence and rancor. One is a blunderbuss, as being a native of Ireland, another, a half-starved louse of literature, from the banks of the Tweed, a third, an ass, because he enjoys a pension from the government, a fourth, the very angel of dullness, because he succeeded in a species of writing in which this Ristarchus had failed, a fifth, who presumed to make strictures upon one of his performances, he holds as a bug in criticism, whose stench is more offensive than his sting. In short, except himself and his myrmidons, there is not a man of genius or learning in the three kingdoms. As for the success of those who have written without the pale of this confederacy, he imputes it entirely to want of taste in the public, not considering that to the approbation of that very tasteless public, he himself owes all the consequence he has in life. Those originals are not fit for conversation. If they would maintain the advantage they have gained by their writing, they should never appear but upon paper. For my part, I am shocked to find a man have sublime ideas in his head, and nothing but illiberal sentiments in his heart. The human soul will be generally found most defective in the article of candor. I am inclined to think, no mind was ever wholly exempt from envy, which, perhaps, may have been implanted, as an instinct essential to our nature. I am afraid we sometimes palliate this vice, under the spacious name of emulation. I have known a person remarkably generous, humane, moderate, and apparently self-denying, who could not hear even a friend commended, without betraying marks of uneasiness, as if that commendation had implied an odious comparison to his prejudice, and every wreath of praise added to the other's character was a garland plucked from his own temples. This is a malignant species of jealousy, of which I stand acquitted in my own conscience. Whether it is a vice, or an infirmity, I leave you to inquire. There is another point, which I would much rather see determined, whether the world was always as contemptible, as it appears to me at present. If the morals of mankind have not contracted an extraordinary degree of depravity, within these 30 years, then must I be infected with the common vice of old men, difficiles, querulus, laudator temporis acti, or, which is more probable, the impetuous pursuits and avocations of youth have formerly hindered me from observing those rotten parts of human nature, which now appear so offensively to my observation. We have been at court, and 'Change, and everywhere we find food for spleen, and subject for ridicule. My new servant, Humphry Clinker, turns out a great original, and Tabby is a changed creature. She has parted with Chowder, and does nothing but smile, like Malvolio in the play. I'll be hanged if she is not acting a part which is not natural to her disposition, for some purpose which I have not yet discovered. With respect to the characters of mankind, my curiosity is quite satisfied. I have done with the science of men, and must now endeavor to amuse myself with the novelty of things. I am, at present, by a violent effort of the mind, forced from my natural bias, but this power ceasing to act, I shall return to my solitude with redoubled velocity. Everything I see, and hear, and feel, in this great reservoir of folly, knavery, and sophistication, contributes to enhance the value of a country life, in the sentiments of yours always, Matt. Bramble. To Mrs. Mary Jones, at Brambleton Hall. Dear Mary Jones, Lady Griskin's butler, Mr. Crumb, having got Squire Barton to frank me a kiver, I would not neglect to let you know how it is with me, and the rest of the family. I could not write by John Thomas, for because he went away in a huff, at a minute's warning. He and Chowder could not agree, and so they fit upon the road, and Chowder bit his thumb, and he swore he would do him a mischief, and he spoke saucy to mistress, whereby the squire turned him off in gudgeon, and by God's providence we picked up another footman, called Humphry Clinker, a good soul as ever broke bread, which shows that a scalded cat may prove a good mouser, and a hound be staunch, though he has got narrow hair on his buttocks, but the proudest nose may be brought to the grindstone by sickness and misfortunes. 0 Molly. What shall I say of London? All the towns that ever I beheld in my born days, are no more than Welsh barrows and cromlechs to this wonderful city. Even Bath itself is but a village, in the name of God. One would think there's no end of the streets, but the Land's End. Then there's such a power of people, going hurry-scurry. Such a racket of coxes. Such a noise, and halabaloo. So many strange sights to be seen. Oh gracious! My poor Welsh brain has been spinning like a top ever since I came hither. And I have seen the park, and the palace of St. Gimses, and the king's and the queen's magisterial pursing, and the sweet young princes, and the elephants, and piebald ass, and all the rest of the royal family. Last week I went with mistress to the Tower, to see the crowns and wild beastes, and there was a monstrous lion, with teeth half a quarter long, and a gentleman bid me not go near him, if I wasn't a maid, being as how he would roar, and tear, and play the dickens. Now I had no mind to go near him, for I cannot abide such dangerous honey mills, not I, but mistress would go, and the beast kept such a roaring and bouncing, that I thought he would have broke his cage and devoured us all, and the gentleman tittered forsooth, but I'll go to death upon it, I will, that my lady is as good a fortune as the child unborn, and, therefore, either the gentleman told a fib, or the lion oft to be set in the stocks for bearing false witness again his neighbor, for the commandment saith, Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. I was afterwards of a party at Sadler's Wells, where I saw such tumbling and dancing upon ropes and wires, that I was frightened and ready to go into a fit. I thought it was all enchantment, and, believing myself bewitched, began for to cry. You knows as how the witches in Wales fly upon broomsticks, but here was flying without any broomstick, or thing in the varsal world, and firing of pistols in the air, and blowing of trumpets, and swinging, and rolling of wheelbarrows upon a wire, God bless us, no thicker than a sewing thread, that, to be sure, they must deal with the devil! A fine gentleman, with a pig's tail, and a golden sword by his side, come to comfort me, and offered for to treat me with a pint of wind, but I would not stay, and so, in going through the dark passage, he began to show his cloven foot, and went for to be rude. My fellow servant, Humphry Clinker, bid him be civil, and he gave the young man a douse in the chops, but, I fackens, Mr. Clinker wa'n't he long in his debt. With a good oaken sapling he dusted his doublet, for all his golden cheese toaster, and, fipping me under his arm, carried me I knows not how, being I was in such a flustration, but, thank God, I'm now vained from all such vanities, for what are all those rarities and vagaries to the glory that shall be revealed hereafter? O Molly! Let not your poor heart be puffed up with vanity. I had almost forgot to tell you, that I have had my hair cut and pippered, and singed, and bolstered, and buckled, in the newest fashion, by a French freezer, parley val Francivi, Madansel. I now carries my head higher than narrow private gentlewoman of Wales. Last night, coming home from the meeting, I was taken by lamplight for an eminent poulterer's daughter, a great beauty, but as I was saying, this is all vanity and vexation of spirit. The pleasures of London are no better than sour whey and stale cider, when compared to the joys of the New Jerusalem. Dear Mary Jones, and please God when I return, I'll bring you a new cap, with a turkey shelcome, and a pie-house sermon, that was preached in the tabernacle, and I pray of all love, you will mind your writing and your spilling, for, craving your pardon, Molly, it made me suet to deceive your last scrabble, which was delivered by the hind at Bath -0, Women. If thou hadst but the least consumption of what pleasure we scholars have, when we can conster the crabidst book off hand, and spell the Ethanich words without looking at the primer. As for Mr. Clinker, he is qualified to be a clerk to a parish, but I'll say no more. Remember me to Saul, poor soul. It goes to my heart to think she don't yet know her letters, but all in God's good time. It shall go hard, but I will bring her the ABC in gingerbread, and that, you knows, will be learning to her taste. Mistress says, we are going along Gurney to the north, but go where we will, I shall ever be, dear Mary Jones, yours with true affection Win. Jenkins, London.